So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to this seminar on small, low-cost fish and their contribution to food and nutrition security. This is the last section of the seminar, which started yesterday morning and is based on the inputs from 4 research projects on the topic. This afternoon, we will start with with a section and with presentations on the segment of the small fish chain that we refer to as distribution and trade. And I'm happy to welcome also Dr. Holly Hapke, who is anthropologist with the University of California in Irvine, and she is also a member of the Fish for Food project. So Holly, as moderator, why don't you take the floor? Go ahead.
All right, thank you. Are we having, very good. And then if you could advance to the next slide. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session on distribution and trade. We have 5 presentations that address various issues related to fish distribution and trade. And collectively, the presentations will consider the following questions. So issues such as through what chains is small and low cost fish distributed? How does this vary between countries and regions over time? And what are the implications thereof for availability and stability of food and nutrition security? How do systems for distribution and trade affect the quality of small fish for low income consumers? Secondly, how does the introduction of new technology impact the organization of fish trade? What are the implications for different groups of traders and their businesses? What are the implications for fish availability for low-income households? A third question is, how do small-scale traders and other market actors deal with disruptions in supply and demand? What do disruptions such as the COVID-19 pandemic reveal about vulnerabilities and resilience in fish value chains? Another question that we're considering is, in what ways do industrial or large-scale commercial demands for fish, so for example, from export trade or the fishmeal industry, rework trade networks and affect the availability of small and low-cost fish for food and nutrition security? And then finally, what role should the state and or international development agencies play, if any, in managing trade in small and low-cost fish? If you could advance to the next slide. What we'll see emerging from this session's presentations is the importance that small-scale traders and informal or traditional market systems play in supplying low-income consumers with fish, and especially the role that women traders play in serving these households. So given this importance, the question of what happens to small-scale trade and traders as fish food systems undergo change or experience disruption, or when new sources of demand emerge, is critical for the potential impacts on low-income consumers' access to fish and food security. And so without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. For our first speaker is Anderson Kwasi Anderson from the University of Amsterdam, who will be talking about fish value chain governance and food security in Ghana. He will then be followed by Sharon Suri, also from the University of Amsterdam, who will talk about small-scale traders and access to fish in the Indonesian case. Then Vivekanandan from Fishmark in India will talk about fisher women as fish vendors and some of the issues they face in terms of adapting to changes, market structures and value chains. Then we turn to the pandemic, and Moenieba Isaacs from the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies at the University of Western Cape in South Africa will share results from a study that she's been involved in, looking at the gendered nature and implications of the pandemic on livelihoods and food flows. And then our final speaker in this special is Joeri Scholtens, also from the University of Amsterdam, who will talk about the fishmeal industry, drivers and consequences for fish in terms of for food. So I think now we can turn to Anderson, and I will turn it over to you. Thank you, Anderson.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are located. My name is Anderson Kwasi Anderson, a PhD candidate at the University of Amsterdam, and I am presenting on fish value chain governance and food security in Ghana. Next slide, please. And this is going to be the outline of my presentation, the rationale, the research questions, the research methods, findings, and some conclusions. Next slide, please. So I'm a member of the Fish for Food project that is investigating the contribution of low-cost fish to food security. And in this study, I am looking at the interactions between the various actors in the fish chains and how these interactions are affecting fish availability, access, quality, and stability for poor urban consumers. Next slide, please. So these are the guiding questions. What are the distribution or market channels for low-cost fish in Ghana? What differences emerge between small pelagic fish chains leading to coastal cities and inland cities in Ghana? And how do governance actors exert influence on small pelagic fish chains to ensure food security for low-income consumers? Next slide, please. So I conducted my research in two cities in Ghana, Accra, which is located along the coast in the south, and then Tamale, which is an inland region in the northern parts of the country. Next slide, please. So the study focused on small pelagic fish chains, such as sardinella, mackerel, anchovies, and I focus on these chains because they are the most important species or small low-cost fish species in the country, and they together account for more than 70% of fish landings in the country. And also the poor urban consumers are known to depend on these chains for their animal protein needs. Next slide, please. So I conducted my field work, as I mentioned, in Accra and in Tamale. In Tamale, I conducted field work twice in 2018. And then in Accra, I conducted field work once. And in all, I interviewed 200 fish traders. I also conducted participant observation and also institutional interviews to gather information for the analysis. Next slide, please. So to the findings. Next slide. So I identified two broad chains that serve the domestic market. We have the smoked fish chain and then the imported fish chain. These are the two broad chains that are used to serve the domestic market. In the local fish chain, when the fish is landed at the landing sites, it goes through the hands of fish mothers, and they control access to fresh fish at the landing beaches. And then the fish is processed immediately after that to prevent spoilage. And then wholesalers, together with some of the processors, help in the distribution and marketing of the fish. I'll highlight some of the differences between the two in the next slide. So this is to give an overview of some of the differences and the similarities between the two fish chains that I spoke about. In the capture fish chain, sardinella, anchovy, and mackerel, which are harvested in Ghanaian waters by artisanal fishermen, dominate the local fish chain, whilst in the imported fish chain, mackerel and sardinella harvested in international waters dominate the fish chain. And in the case of the imported fish chain, the fish imports come into the country through the Tema fishing harbor. We also have the Takoradi fishing harbor in the western part of the country, but in Accra and the surrounding communities, as well as the northern part of the country, it is the fish that comes to Tema that is used to supply this area, these communities. But in the case of the local fishing, the fish is landed at landing beaches across the coastal communities. And the method for processing and preserving fish in the local fish chain is mostly smoking, but drying, salting, fermenting, etc. are also used. But in the case of the imported fish chain, it is freezing that is used to process the fish. But somewhere along the line, fish vendors come in, they buy the fish from cold stores, and then they process using smoking, and then they distribute to consumers in their neighborhoods. In terms of distribution, women perform the distribution and marketing of fish in the case of the local fishing. In the case of imported fishing, coastals are involved in the distribution and marketing, but at a certain point, fish vendors also come in to distribute the fish to consumers. Ordinary trucks are used in transporting the local fish chain, whilst in the imported fish chain, they use specialized cold vans to transport the fish from the port, the Tema Fishing Harbour, to cold stores in Accra and in Tamale. But it takes a shorter time to transport fish to Accra because of the closeness of Accra to Tema, whilst it takes about a day to get the fish to cold stores in Tamale. So it is obvious that in the local fish chain, there is the lack of refrigeration, and so they transport the fish without any cold conditions. But in the imported fish chain, they have to maintain adequate conditions so that the fish will not spoil. So they transport them using the cold vans that I mentioned. And also in the imported fish chain, they keep the fish in cold storage facilities to prevent spoilage, whilst in the local fish chain, they keep the fish in baskets covered with sacks and rubbers. And yesterday we saw that they add some chemicals to prevent insect attacks and all that. The two chains serve the domestic market. Next slide, please. So this is just to give an overview of the geographical nature of the fish chains. So in the first figure depicts flows of imported fish to Tamale, and coastals in Tamale, in Bolgatanga and in Wa, that is coastals in the northern part of the country, get their stocks from Tema in the southern part of the country. So various arrangements are used to get the fish. Sometimes the coastal operators or managers come to Tema to buy the fish, and then they get transport to transport the fish to their cold facilities. In other instances, they arrange through agents or through a phone call, and then the fish will be packaged and sent to them in Tamale. And also in the middle belt of Ghana, where we have Kumasi and Techiman, these two cities are also important sources of fish for coastals in Tamale. Sometimes there are sister facilities that are located in these locations, so they can just, instead of traveling all the way to Tema in the south, they just go to Techiman or Kumasi, which is a bit closer to them, and then they can get the fish. So coastals play a very important role in getting low cost fresh but frozen fish for consumers in Tamale. And then in the smoked fish chain, that is the next figure on the right. Traders in Tamale get their supplies from the southern part of the country, but Accra is the main important market for fish traders. They travel to Accra. In Accra, they have central markets where they can buy the fish on wholesale, and then they transport them to Tamale for further distribution. But as I indicated, Techiman in the middle belt of the country is an important market for smoked fish as well. So traders, instead of coming to Accra, can just travel to Techiman, which is closer to them, and then they can buy the fish. Some also rely on Hafasini, Sekendi, Takrady, and Moenieba, which are also important fish markets to get their fish. But in some of these locations, they rely on their relatives who are in these locations, and then they can get fish to them. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as I mentioned, Accra is the most important market in southern Ghana for fish traders. So smoked fish from coastal communities that are scattered along the coast transport the fish to Accra to go and sell. In Accra, we have, they bring their fish to important central markets like the Agboboloshi market and then the Mamprobi market. We also have the Adabraka market where they sell their fish. Also, when they can, processors who are from the coastal communities also move further inland to Kumasi and to Techiman to market their fish. Next slide, please. So to some governance interactions that are identified in the chain, we have market interactions, which takes place within the market space. In these interactions, traders sell their fish to whomever is available and ready to buy. And these relationships are very loose. And so customers can just switch to the next available buyer if the conditions of the transactions is not favorable. And then I also identify relational relationships within, which takes place within the market and also over distance. In this, the sellers sell the fish to buyers with whom they are related or have developed long-term relationships, through frequent transactions. The relationships are based on trust, and so on trust, mutual reliance on each other for mutual benefit. And then the transactions are based on informal arrangements, usually credit. They give the fish to you on credit, you sell, and then you pay back. And then also, I identified captive relationships which exist between fish mothers, the traders of fish, fresh fish, and then small-scale fishermen. These fish mothers are either boat owners or they are financiers of fishing operations of fishers. So they supply resources to the fishers to aid their fishing activities. And these fish mothers also support fish processes by giving fish to them on credit, and then they pay later. Next slide, please. So the private sector, now to some of the influences along the fish chain. The private sector is highly influential in the fish chain. The fish mothers process the fish immediately after landing, and then the fish mothers, together with wholesalers who are located along the chains, distribute and market the fish in urban markets. And these activities encourage availability and accessibility of fish in urban markets as well as other fish consumption areas. And in captive relationships, the fish mothers support small-scale fishers with resources for fishing, and also they support other small-scale fish processes by supplying fish to them on credit. Next slide, please. So fish processors, large traders, and importers play a very important role in ensuring year-round availability of fish. As I mentioned, the fishmongers process fish and store as much as they can during bumper catch, and large traders who also have large storage capacity also buy the fish during this time and store. And during the lean season, when fish goes down, fish capture goes down, they release this fish into the market to ensure that there is a fish during the lean season. As I mentioned, imports of fish complement local supplies, and this role is very, very important during the lean season as they ensure that there is fish during such periods. and look up the processors, fish processors can just substitute by resorting to imports to process and supply onto the market. However, seasonality is something that affects the fish value chains. It affects production and supply. And so seasonal effects, even though the imports complement the local production, seasonal dynamics leads to reduced availability during the lean season, and this leads to increased fish prices during the lean season, and this affects consumers' access to fish during such periods. Next slide, please. However, even though the private sector ensures availability, access, and stability, one aspect that is a source of concern is fish quality and safety. Fish quality and safety could be compromised due to unhygienic handling of fish by exposing fish to flies, poor personal hygiene among the fish actors, unhygienic conditions in the market space. There is also inadequate the use of inadequate packaging materials to package fish for consumers, such as the use of dirty cement, papers, etc. And also there is chemical adulteration in the fish, and this is a study conducted by the Fish for Food Project, and we identified widespread use of DDT, formalin, and other insecticides and other chemicals to process and preserve fish. Next slide, please. This is just an overview to show where the external actors perform their roles in the fish chain. The state is more involved in regulating fish capture, and then NGOs as well. The Ghana Standards Authority and the local assemblies, they play a role in the post-harvest fish chain. Next slide, please. So I realized that the state has a limited influence in fish chains, and the state is focused so much on regulating capture fisheries. However, the capacity to implement and enforce regulations remain weak in the fish chain, and as a result, regulators are overwhelmed by the numerous boats that are fishing in Ghanaian waters. The state agencies appear to be highly influential in the import and then the export section of the fish chains, and we have the Ghana Standards Authority that is regulating exports of fish to international markets to ensure that the fish that is leaving our shores are they meet international standards. And also the Food and Drugs Authority is stationed at the harbor, at the Tema Fishing Harbor, and what they do is to control imports that are coming into the country to ensure that the fish that is coming is wholesome for public consumption. Next slide, please. In conclusion, the domestic market depends on fish supplies from the local and imported fish chains. The private actors in market, relational, and captive relationships ensure availability, access, and stability of fish in the domestic market. But seasonal dynamics leads to increased fish prices, which will affect consumers' purchases of fish during the lean season. The state agencies also focus much on regulating fish capture and imports and exports. Next slide, please. And there is the need to address fish quality and safety in the country. And we also have to start thinking about organizing the women into fish processors and traders associations so that we can reach out to them with interventions. And there is also the need to improve capacity of regulatory institutions. Next slide, please. Now to conclude with policy recommendations, there is the need to support and strengthen small pelagic fish chains, since low-income consumers depend on them for their animal protein needs. And also there is the need to put in place deliberate policy to work on improving the capacity of fish traders by targeting fish traders and processors associations. When we organize them, then we can reach out to them and help improve their capacity. We also have to improve the capacity of regulatory institutions so that they can control the domestic fish chain. Apart from fish capture and then imports and exports, the other segments of the domestic chain is not controlled. They are not controlled. And so once we improve the capacity of these institutions, they will be able to help control and monitor fish as it moves to consumers. Also, we have to put in place support strategies to improve transport and distribution systems to facilitate access to markets, reduce transportation and transaction costs and ensure availability of quality fish in local markets. Also, some policy reforms to reduce price fluctuations will also help. Thank you. The next slide, and that is I thank the Fish for Food Project for funding my research work, and then also my promoters for their assistance so far. Next slide. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Anderson. I neglected to mention that we would like participant or attendees to insert any questions that they have into the Q&A box, and after the 5 presentations, we'll then turn to question and answers and discussion. Okay, our next speaker is Sharon Suri. Sharon, I'm going to let you go ahead.
Thank you. This seminar has so far discussed the production, processing, and consumption of small fish. But how does this fish get from being produced and processed to the plates of consumers? This is where the traders come in. I argue that there's a key role for small-scale traders in facilitating access to fish for certain consumer groups, particularly for low-income consumers and those who are geographically distant from fish-producing areas. And not just facilitating access, but facilitating stable access through the extension of credit. After all, people don't need nutritious food just once, they need it every day. So my research focuses on mobile traders in Indonesia who sell and move fish to consumers who would otherwise be unable to access this nutrient-dense food. Next, please. So what makes Indonesia an interesting case? Well, globally, it's one of the largest fish producers in the world for capture fisheries, for aquaculture, aquatic plants. At the national level, over 50% of animal protein also comes from fish. This does, of course, vary by region, but it demonstrates the importance of fish in the diet. And as discussed by previous panelists, government policy in Indonesia promotes the production of fish for export. Well, which fish are these? High-priced fish, such as tuna, shrimp, and so on. Next, please. So what informs this research? Well, this is based off of 6 months of ethnographic fieldwork in North Sumatra, interviewing and observing fish traders along the supply chain, from those purchasing directly from fishers, to the aggregators and small toke that fish passes to next, to the larger toke and traders receiving it at local markets, and then to the traders who supply more rural areas, such as mobile traders. I also interviewed consumers, including those buying directly from these mobile traders, and also recipients of government aid through the PKH Social Protection Program. This fieldwork was also supplemented by a series of remote interviews since the onset of COVID-19. Next, please. So who are these traders or middlemen? Well, 2 key actors are the toke and the along-along. Looking at the toke first, these intermediaries are found across multiple agricultural commodity chains in Indonesia, for example, palm oil. They establish relationships with producers and various other traders based on the extension of equipment or finance. For example, a toke who buys directly from fishers would own several boats and some fishing equipment. The fishers who use these boats and equipment must then sell their catch to that toke. Thus, they can't shop around and try to get a higher price for their fish. These fishers are part of the membership group or anggota of the toke. Toke range in size from small to large, and smaller toke can be part of the membership group of a larger toke. The small toke gets the financing from the larger toke to go and purchase those boats and equipment in order to recruit fisher members. The small toke then aggregates the product from those fishers and sells it on to the larger toke. Thus, fish moves forward through the supply chain. The larger toke often focus on particular kinds of fish, with some oriented more towards export and others towards domestic consumption. Toke relationships can be more or less balanced. There are certainly information asymmetries, and some could be characterized as exploitative. But at the same time, they fill a critical void for finance in what is a pretty risky business. Next slide, please. Now onto the mobile traders. Another important group is the mobile traders, locally known as pedagang along-along, who sell fish and other perishable goods via motorbike. In contrast to food delivery apps such as GoFood, kind of like Uber Eats, these traders have no guarantee that everything they've bought will sell. Leftover fresh fish can be resold for 1 to 2 more days. After that, traders may salt the fish to then resell it as dried. This provides a way to reduce losses, though they may not recoup what they paid for the fish in the first place. I followed some mobile traders, sometimes even starting from their homes, to the local market where their day starts before 4 a.m. Here they pick out the fish, vegetables, and other goods they will take for resale, and pay back their suppliers for the previous day's goods. Sometimes they do also get fish directly from small producers, but this is less common. From there, traders travel out to rural communities. The map below shows the routes taken by 2 different traders starting from the market, or the purple dot. The red and yellow nodes are all the stops they make along these routes. You can't see this level of detail here, but there can easily be 30 or more stops before heading home in the late morning or afternoon. The distances are as the crow flies and don't reflect the condition of the roads, which are often unpaved. There are also mobile traders who go double this distance or farther. Next slide, please. So who do they reach? Well, mobile traders have a mixed customer base, from folks close enough to go to the market themselves, but who prefer the convenience of traders coming to them, to communities farther out who aren't able to go to the market often. Some customers are well off, running businesses with employees, while many others struggle to get by, receiving cash income only at the end of the harvest cycle, or are dependent on direct cash transfers for the government, dispersed every 3 months. That is to say, much of their customer base has a limited or irregular cash flow. Households receiving government welfare typically display a sign with the PKH program name prominently displayed. From my observation, the frequency of these signs greatly increased the farther traders got from market. Talking to customers along these routes, numerous people said that the mobile trader was their only means of purchasing fish. Of these, many also said that they were only able to buy fish because of the credit that that particular mobile trader extended to them, and that without that credit, they would reduce their consumption of fish and replace this with tofu or tempeh. I discuss these details about their customers as it illustrates who accesses fish through this channel, and perhaps more importantly, who is only able to access fish in this way. Next, please. Now, being a toke or an along-along requires taking on risk, which largely relates to fluctuations and instability in the chain. Some fluctuations are predictable, while others less so. Production volumes vary on things based like the full moon and seasonal winds, the light of the full moon making it harder for fishers to lure fish into their nets, and high winds limiting fishers' ability to go out to sea. Both result in less product or fish to move into markets. Irregular or infrequent payment cycles can stifle the buying power of consumers. Trying to stretch limited funds out for months at a time often results in lean periods where there just isn't much cash on hand to purchase food, resulting in reduced dietary diversity as people prioritize staples such as rice. And then there are less predictable shocks. In October, November of 2019, an outbreak of pig cholera drastically drove down prices across the province. Now, how does a pig disease affect fish prices? Well, the outbreak led to a massive culling of pigs, many of which were then dumped into waterways, not just polluting the water with rotting carcasses, but rendering the fish haram or forbidden for the largely Muslim population. Not long after this, the COVID pandemic hit. With fish exports halted as countries rushed to close their borders, many consumers saw their incomes and purchasing power suddenly decrease. This contributed to a glut of fish sitting in the market with limited cold storage. Then, the government expanded direct food aid, adding in items such as eggs. And it's not to say that this food aid wasn't critical for the food security of consumers, but it further depressed sales for traders. Next, please. So one of the biggest buffering strategies seems to be the extension of credit in normal times and the extension of repayment terms, particularly during shocks or crises. This is both between tokes and their membership groups, and also between mobile traders and their customers. This allows fish to keep moving and for consumers to continue buying fish even during lean periods. However, there are limitations to this. The credit is entirely dependent upon the trader's own capital, and not everyone repays their debts. One mobile trader had to cut off 6 to 7 families in 2019 and double that the previous year. A toke in the market described traders who took fish but never returned to pay as orangutans. Mobile traders pick an assortment of fish each day, depending on price, quality, and what they think their customers will buy. This includes both fresh and dried fish, which is sometimes cheaper, but still nutrient dense. This mix of fish allows them to meet a range of price points. But again, there's no guarantee that everything will sell. Though fresh fish can be sold as fresh for several days, the price and quality both decrease. And then some fluctuations or shocks extend longer than traders can buffer for. After the pig cholera and during the COVID pandemic, many traders, particularly mobile traders, reported reducing the number of days a week they worked, with some opting to shift professions altogether. Some had already been considering shifting to different lines of work, and these shocks only encouraged it. But for the consumers who are dependent upon these traders, what happens if the traders don't come back? Next, please. So what do we do with this? Well, there's been a trend in agricultural interventions to make value chains more lean and efficient, emphasizing direct relationships between producers and consumers. Middlemen can be seen almost as leeches, capturing a disproportionate share of the financial value. And so interventions can aim to reduce their involvement. And this is not to say that all trader relationships are characterized by equal profit sharing. But at the same time, if traders are pushed out by crisis or intervention, what does this mean for those consumers who are dependent upon these traders to access and afford fish? My perspective is that many of these traders, particularly small-scale traders, are critical to getting fish from boats to consumer households. There are many consumers who will never be directly linked to fish producers and are as such reliant upon these intermediaries. Next slide. My take-home message is this: interventions need to reflect on the diversity of consumers and the range of distribution channels and supply chain actors to reach them. Supporting traders can support stable consumer access as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Sharon. That was a very insightful presentation. Next up, we have Vivekanandan from Fishmark. Vivek, whenever you're ready, you may begin.
My video has been stopped by the host.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
My video has been stopped by the host, it says. So can okay, thank you. Good afternoon for those in Europe, and good evening for those from South Asia and Southeast Asia and good morning to Holly. I'm going to present a little bit about the fisherwomen of India, particularly marine fishermen women who work as fish vendors, providing consumers with fish directly, and we get an idea about their life, their livelihood issues, and also the way forward. Next slide, please. So historically, marine fisherwomen have played a major role in post-harvest and marketing for the combination of the fact that in India we have caste system and a particular community or a set of communities specialize in marine fishing. And within marine fishing, as we all know, what is near universal is the gender division of labor. So the women have, where the men go to sea and the women have been taking care of the post-harvest and marketing. And this was something that was done by virtually all women in the community at one point in time in history. However, due to modernization of fisheries, economic development, bringing infrastructure, transport, ice, and so on, there has been a drastic change in the fish utilization pattern, which means from traditionally processed fish dominating the market, we now have substantially fresh or chilled fish as the main source or the main product in the domestic market, particularly the domestic market. For the export chain, it is largely frozen. So for the domestic chain today, fresh fish or chilled fish has become the main product, and therefore a vast majority of women have lost their employment in the post-harvest sector as part of the household economy. Now, a group of them specialize in fresh fish vending, and to a certain extent, dry fish also. So if about 1 million fishermen go to sea in India, roughly about 200,000 fish women are involved in the fish trade as fish vendors. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. So a quick glimpse of what this fish vending is all about. I'm using the term fish vendors. There is a mobile trader being used in elsewhere. We heard about the fishmongers. So various terminologies are being used. The fish vendor is probably synonymous with many of them. But basically, it's a one-person operation. What she can handle in terms of weight and value, and what she can sell in a day. This is a typical fish vendor. And she goes to retail markets wherever they exist and convenient and where she has access, squats there and sells. Or there are many wayside markets that have come up informally. People find places where consumers congregate and start selling fish and other day-to-day requirements, could be vegetables, etc. And there are a fairly large group who have certain localities where they visit every home or their regular customers' homes and supply fish. So different modes of fish vending. Historically, they have depended on fish coming in from their own villages, landings of their own villages or neighboring villages, dating from their own husbands, brothers, and kith and kin. Today, with the concentration of fish in mechanized landing centers, large landing centers, fishing harbors, women have to now travel far and wide, maybe to fishing harbors or to wholesale markets which get fish from distant locations, distant landing centers, and buy from them. So they have to travel a lot. They also have to now travel long distances to sell fish because they have now better modes of transport and so on. So they are also increased their reach. They depend mostly on informal money market for their working capital. There are at least half a dozen different channels of informal credit available to our women. Next, please. So I thought we should, in the Indian context, maybe quite true in many other places, the significance of this particular group, this 200,000 women in fish vending, and why they are important and why we need to worry about them and why we need to take care of them. So from a fishing community perspective, which is an important community there. So in fact, what's probably of interest is that the same community, as far as marine fish is concerned, the origin of the chain is once again the community, the menfolk of the community. The end of the chain is often with the women from the community as fish vendor. This is particularly in the coastal stretch. They don't go interior to sell. They work within the coastal districts. So the women are part of they are the last mile, and the first production source is also the men. So the entire community depends on both these livelihoods. So that is very important to understand, that there is a strong community dimension. These are not just individual traders eking out their own existence, but they are part of a larger community, which depends on this, the larger economy, fish economy. So the decline of catches of the small-scale fishermen and their profitability due to competition from bigger boats, and the shift of a lot of the catch to the major centers has hit the small-scale fishing community. So the women bringing income through fish vending is an important means to stabilize the economy of the community. Another thing that we find in some of the areas where we did study, a thumb rule we have developed is, on an average, a small-scale fisher brings back income for the household only about 100 days in a year. Many of the other days, he either doesn't go fishing or he doesn't make enough money to cover costs. While the women bring home fish sometimes even 300 days a year, it is a stable and steady occupation. May not be as lucrative at times as the small-scale fishermen who might have a very good catch of prawn or a bumper landing of something else, with all its risks and fluctuations. Having said that, since not all women are in trade, since all households do not necessarily have women in fish vending, you would say that by and large, the women in fish vending come from the poorer households, women-headed households, households where the men are not able to earn much due to sickness, maybe even drunkenness, and so on. And then you also have women who are now supplementing husbands' income because they want the children to go to school and college, and the fishing income is not enough. So it's a mix of a variety of categories. But overall, the thumb rule is it's often the poorer third household, 1/3 of the households in the village. So the fish vending is an important survival mechanism of the fishing community itself. Now, in addition, the Fish for Food program, to which I was also part of, has shown how the women fish vendors play a very important role to reach the small pelagics to the poor urban households. And they have a significant role in this for the very simple reason that they can sell in very small portions. And they can sell, they can keep dividing the size as much as required to feed a person. So it is therefore an advantage. The credit system that was mentioned in Indonesia is also very much part of this household. Door-to-door delivery is certainly based on credit. Next, please. Now, I'm trying to now put together a list of the kind of grievances or the issues, the problems that these 200,000 women face across the coast in different coastal towns, villages that they operate. The landing centers where they go to buy the fish, the wholesale markets where they go to fish, buy the fish, and the retail markets where they go and sell. All these have very poor working conditions, very poor in their facilities, and especially unfriendly to the women. No toilets for the females, exclusively for the females, no resting rooms, no place to stock their fish temporarily, any number of problems, noisy, very difficult to, very dirty, unhygienic. So the conditions are not at all good for the women, and probably which have a considerable amount of influence on the quality of fish in the entire chain, and also the nutrition and the health of the consumer is all affected by this poor quality infrastructure and poor quality maintenance and governance of these infrastructures. Then women, when they are in their own retail markets or even in the wholesale markets where they go to buy fish, there's considerable amount of discrimination in many parts because they are in competition with male vendors in many of these places. Male vendors may take prime spots in the retail markets, pushing the women to the margins or the back of the back benches. They may not have the access to the first consumers who arrive. There are many instances and many situations of this kind. This competition from male vendors is increasing in the last decade or so, probably a decade and a half in particular. It suddenly become. There has been a fair amount of coexistence over the historically between the male and female vendors. Male vendors come from other communities by and large, not from the fishing communities, and they have a certain coexistence. But increasingly, many of the markets, many of the cities, the urban unemployment, migration from other areas to these cities has created a situation where this is some kind of an open access system. If you can put some money and if you can jump in and you learn a little bit through hard experience how to run this business, you can get into it. And it's still largely informal trade. There's no need for any permits. There's no need for again, Bombay, where about 20,000 or so women fish vendors, India's largest city, Mumbai, old name Bombay, colonial city. It's our financial capital. About 20,000 women fish vendors, all from the fishing community, have been historically selling there. Today, the last 10-15 years, we have migrants from other parts of India, North and Eastern India, who land up in Bombay for jobs, and some of them take to running auto rickshaws or taxis. Some of them, among other things, get into fish vending. They have aggressive strategies for procurement and they have aggressive strategies to sell. And the women are struggling to compete with them, both in procurement and in sales today. There's no technology support for reducing the drudgery and improving returns. Today, practically all fishermen at least have a small outboard motor in India. So a proportionate investment in fish vendors, the fisherwomen's livelihoods is missing. There's very little opportunities or very little technology and very little way of upgrading their thing and reducing the drudgery, including good quality ice boxes and so on. We find everywhere some kind of temporary makeshift thermocol boxes being used. So it is a major gap. Transportation is another big problem. So also considerably affected by the cultural, gender-related issue that people of these kind of traditional communities, the women, do not drive two-wheelers. So the male vendors have the advantage. They are more flexible and more, they can reach their destination quicker. Women have to form groups, 2 or 3 of them hire an auto rickshaw or a small truck and go to markets to buy. And then once again, similar mode of transport to reach markets. Wherever the public transport is accepting them and they have access, they take the public transport. So transportation, so I know in some of the rural districts that we have connections, there are women who walk even 10 to 15 kilometers a day to sell the fish. So transportation is a great problem. Gaps in credit and financial services, especially in the sense that credit per se is not, let's say, unavailable, but the cost of the credit is the issue. So there are various systems which are all quite expensive, informal systems, and the risks involved in informal systems, the problems related to that push up the cost. In principle, in India, the banks are all accessible to the common people, like the fisherwomen. But in reality, it is not easy to access those funds. So institutional credit at reasonable price is not available. So their cost of capital is quite high. And targeted social protection and welfare schemes are by and large absent. This category of fish vendor is not precisely understood. It's loosely taken that all fisherwomen are same, etc. So there is a very little targeting, very little that goes and reaches. And because of the drudgery involved, the long distances, the hard work that they do, occupational health issues are also quite high, and they are often not taken care of. In fact, women don't have the time to go and take care of themselves, go to a doctor, go to a hospital. They are busy around the week selling fish. And maybe the weekly holiday, wherever that is there culturally, they will have to do family related matters or go to church or whatever. And recently, the COVID impact has also led to some interesting or new phenomena. Sudden increase in competition. The decline of many livelihoods during the COVID lockdown meant that quite a lot of people from other communities, from the city areas, jumped in with a little bit of capital and started competing with the women as fish vendors. From the fishing community itself, the relatively stable number of women who have been going for fish vending has suddenly, increased. A lot of women have from the community, it may be temporary, we do not know, have moved into the trade, competing in already a relatively competitive situation. Next, please.
Vivek, could you wind up in about 5 minutes?
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. So no problem. The interventions. So for one, the state, these women fall below between different cracks. I know many fisheries departments, there's nobody even, no office or desk responsible for fish vendors or their welfare or their livelihood. So they are completely below the radar of most fisheries departments. The corporation and municipal authorities are often finding them more of a nuisance. So there's very little policy attention, there's very little support for them. NGOs have been working in different parts of the coast here and there. The fair amount of them are probably in microcredit, but they are not also very successful because they don't target fish vendors as specifically. And their cost of capital also is nowadays quite high because the microfinance sector also become a little bit usurious in our country. The fish vendors are very weakly organized and represented, and some CSOs are very successfully done. Some work on them, organizing them and taking up their rights and issues. Where there has been collective action, there has been some successes like special transport arrangement for fish vendors in parts of Kerala. It's an example. Overall, most attempts have suffer from conceptual and implementation failures. Next. I will highlight a few of the pitfalls and issues that many people, whatever little the state and the NGOs have done, where the mistakes or where the failures are there. There's an issue in targeting. Programs are meant for generic fisherwomen rather than those who specialize in fish vending. So the housewives in the community are easier to reach, and they participate in many of these things more easily, where the vendors are away early in the morning and come back late in the night. So they are not in a position to participate in many of these interventions. So even microcredit ends up finally with the housewives rather than necessarily even the fish vendors. Next. Then we have state programs in particular suffer from, there is this strong fixation in the mind of authorities, because we have a lot of fishery science institutions and academic institutions who believe the solution for everything is value addition. So women have been trained all over the coast any number of times on fish handling and making products and things like that. This is an ongoing activity. But the reality is women fish vendors just do not have the time to make other products. They leave early in the morning, they come back late in the morning. If they run their business, they make good money. And if it can be properly submitted, they can make even better money. But instead, this whole idea that they will make products doesn't work. With the fish catches being largely, marine fish catches being largely stagnant, the fish availability for value addition is not there. The fresh fish prices are quite high. So when you have bulk landings and prices crash, maybe there is a possibility, but those instances are relatively low in many parts of the coast. So it doesn't work out. And it's also, you make a product and you can't just sell it as an individual fisherman. You need group activity, group organization, marketing linkages and so on. These things never happen. Next. We did some work in supported by FAO in district Tamil Nadu, Nagapattinam, on trying to improve the quality of the fish handled by the women. And it was an experiment, and we did some pilots, and we found that there are the kind of odds that are against this is very high. Next slide, please. So, see, the women have very little control over the quality of the product that they are selling. The problem starts from the small boat which brings the pelagic fish. This was in Nagapattinam, it's a rural district substantially. So they brought small pelagics, which the women want to buy. There's no icing of it because large quantities of small pelagic cannot be put in the small ice box on a small boat. So it's on board, and few hours without ice. It already has a certain limit. Once it lands, it is there for quite a bit of time, either on the sand or some tarpaulin. The removal of the fish from the net takes time. Then it has to be cleaned and washed, quite often in contaminated water from near shore waters, etc. And so there is a deterioration. Once it reaches the auction center in the village, which today in Nagapattinam, because of tsunami, they all have some cement floors, but it's not necessarily very hygienic or absolutely spotless. So it's not very clean. It's there for some time before it can be sold. There's a lot of contamination, and it lies idle for some time. Then preservation, once it comes to the women vendor, she takes some time to buy 2-3 lots of fish, and then only she starts icing. The icing is inadequate and proper, and we find that the icing thing is not so simple, because if she puts this 2:1 recommended proportion, she will only take 1/3 of the weight that she carries as fish, which she can sell. The other 2/3 is something that she has to carry. So reality is there are many constraints in which icing doesn't really take place to the extent advised, or even if they are fully aware of it. The ice quality itself is very poor, but because the ice plant in the nearby area has got water of, even in the color doesn't look very good. Then you have packaging and transport. You have the huge issues, the distances, the time. And finally, you go to the sale. This is something not, of course, true everywhere in India, but many places in India. Nagapattinam, surely, even in an extremely literate state like Kerala, the capital city, Trivandrum, the local public thinks very poorly of iced fish. Historically, they have thought iced fish is long distance fish and therefore of poor quality. So the fisherwoman gets rid of the ice before the consumer can spot it and tries to sell it. So this is to give you the kind of range of things. In fact, I can spend a whole hour explaining the various constraints. Next slide, please. Okay, a number of things which we have identified, just a list of various kinds of factors that are influencing fish quality. So a few trainings of fish vendors is not going to change this. They're just so far many constraints. Next, please. So today we are the need, if we have to get this important group to have a decent life and to have a decent livelihood, a good livelihood, the work that one has to do is quite a lot. There are far too many. It requires a multi-pronged approach. Next, please. We learned a lot of this through a couple of FAO projects and the Fishmeal project, and we have been also experimenting and trying out many of the things, solutions for some of these problems. So that is where we are coming up, and we are increasingly clear that fish vendors have to have their own organizations and be able to represent themselves. They exist in some pockets, in some locations, some cities here and there, but overall, the level of organization and representation is very weak. So the collective action is extremely important. And collective action is required of two types of collective action. One is for their rights. Some of the things is what rest of society and state has to provide them. They can't go and improve a market, the infrastructure of a market. It has to be public investment. So various things like that. So there is a whole issue of taking up their rights to ensure that they get the transport, to get the minimum facilities, that there are toilets in the thing, there is good water in these markets. and they are not displaced from the market just because a road widening takes place or somebody decides to demolish the market, etc. So there's a whole rights-based issue. And there are quite a lot of things where collective action for economic betterment is very much possible. Collective organization accessing bank loans, institutional credit, improving their own facilities, getting insurance. There are various schemes available for pensions. So financial services, fish marketing, we are even now experimenting with fish vendor groups now buy directly from distant markets, bypassing the wholesale markets where have this competition and reduce competition, etc. So there are many such areas that we can work on. So you need to really look at two types of intervention. Next, please. So there is a right stream agenda, which I've already given some indication, which includes the role that women should have a big say in how these markets operate where they are. They should be even part of the governance. Next, please. And then what I call the techno-economic agenda, which is a cooperative agenda, savings and credit insurance, ice boxes, digital payments. We are working on some technical ideas of foldable kiosks, because of these wayside markets don't have any legal status. You can't put up anything which even looks semi-permanent. So there are locations where we are looking at some kind of simple things which can be folded and taken away, but which protects the women and the fish from the elements. Next. So basically we are saying that fisherwomen organization, fish vendor organizations are people. Anderson has also talked about it. I think my other people in the panel have also talked about it. We need these organizations, and we need to, wherever they exist, they need to be supported and strengthened to be able to take on their work. Next, please. A key to all this would be partnerships, because we are talking of multiple issues. There is no single department which is capable of delivering this in government. Nor a single NGO can do any of it, nor an institution. It requires partnerships. Fish vendor organization, civil society organizations, other fisheries departments, municipal corporations, research institutions, financial institutions, private corporations, donors, all have to work together. Next. So finally, I would say the women fish vendors in India and perhaps wherever a similar tribe exists, they need a new deal. We need to recognize that their problems cannot be resolved by unidimensional programs. Concerted and coordinated actions are required from many agencies. Strong vendor organizations can represent vendors, and those that can provide techno-economic services are both needed. Considerable amount of experimentation and creative work is called for to make these ideas, take these ideas to a successful conclusion. Thank you. Sorry for overrunning the time.
All right, thank you very much, Vivek. Let's move on now and look at the issue of COVID and how that has interfered or disrupted fish value change. And so I will invite Moenieba Isaacs to give her presentation. And just a reminder to everyone to please enter your questions in the Q&A box, and we're compiling them and we'll get to them after the last speaker.
Good afternoon, everybody. Great to be in this forum. I see lots of former friends and colleagues around the world. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this. And my apologies, I'm stepping in and out of this meeting. So my talk is mainly on a rapid response project that is funded by the IDRC Canada, and it's basically for a year. And it looks at the food system, but my talk, the African food system, not only fish, but also other crops and products. So my talk is basically on small and low cost fisheries in the time of COVID-19, and I use different cases in Africa to highlight this. Look at the gendered nature, implications on livelihoods, and also specifically the food flows. Next slide, please. So basically, the objectives of the project is basically to look at, to collect real-time qualitative and quantitative information about the impact of the COVID regulations and the support interventions on functioning of local production systems, the forward and backward linkages, the structure of the governance of the formal and informal market and value chain, and also the composition of the spatial configuration of the consumer food environment. And we're particularly focusing on the poor, vulnerable, and marginalized populations. We analyze and synthesize the information to derive lessons about the changes and what does it mean to the political economy of the agro-food system during COVID, and also the relationships, the interests, the interactions between key actors and also food system. So in the end, we want to kind of also to inform and catalyze the political and policy debates amongst the state and non-state actors in terms of political and social, and also in terms of what are the palliative measures that have been designed during COVID and how are they functioning at local level. So particularly we look for this particular presentation, how the regulatory support and responses affect the functioning of this food systems, but also looking at those in the informal market, those who are transporting, the financiers, producers, aggregators, traders, input suppliers and others, with what is the impact on the food flow, the volumes, the pricing, and how are women and marginalized actors particularly affected by this. And next slide, please. So the method is basically looking at primary data collection, key informant and in-depth interviews, a number of social dialogues with fisher groups and civil society organizations. And we're looking at, because of COVID, we introduced the food system diaries, selecting key people in the value chain and get bi-weekly update on the reality on the ground. We look at key concepts like the political economy and how that influenced the African food system. And secondary data is basically mined from newspaper and also grey literature, but also there's definitely literature coming out of in terms of some of the kind of articles. So we source both secondary and grey literature. So the rationale for the case study selection was basically that in South Africa we had a hard lockdown, and in Ghana there was a medium lockdown. Tanzania never had a lockdown, but some restrictions were in place in terms of market activities, hand washing and mask wearing. Our case studies in Ghana is in Wa, Techiman and Accra. South Africa, it's Cape Town, Johannesburg and Pietermaritzburg. And in Dar es Salaam, in Tanzania, it's Dar es Salaam, Mwanza and Arusha. I'm also using examples of Nigeria and Zimbabwe in this presentation. Next slide, please. So some of the preliminary findings, because I know we are tight with time, is that in all country case studies, governments have introduced the measures that affect the domestic value chain, such as rationalizing the access to the actual food market to ensure social distancing, and in terms of moving some of the markets to bigger spaces. In Tanzania, it was found that domestic food purchases fell from March with fewer consumers visiting the market, but also consumer buying and eating less. At some time, there was more focus, government focus on immune boosting crops and spices such as lemon, garlic, and ginger, lime, and onion, and saw price increases and the demand rose for that. But with particularly garlic and ginger, remedies doubling at one point. So we could see that they were the prices of crops were quite particularly increased during this time. Because of the closure of borders and the imposition of the export and import restrictions around the world, as well as production losses and disrupting the food flows, in Ghana, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, cross-border trade played a crucial role in sustaining food flows. And when government lifted restrictions on the market and food supply, one could see a significant difference in the food flows and also in terms of food security in Tanzania under COVID. In Nigeria specifically, fish supplies were impeded. In some areas, fish traders were excluded from the operations, closures and restrictions on movements in terms of internal trade, metropolitan areas. Some of them traders besieged in terms of fish landings, so leading to price hikes and shortages, and also creating cash-strapped rural fishers facing rising costs and opting to eat less fish. And we've seen in this some of the presentations that I listened to that we don't need to eat fish occasionally. We need to eat fish regularly and to kind of sustain the nutritional importance of fish. And government basically failed small-scale fishers to special in Nigeria for special support and fishing cooperations. We also saw that the restriction on movement in limited production in South Africa, and also in the Kapenta fisheries in Zimbabwe, where because of transport prices were increased and certain people got permits to transport the fish, the Kapenta fisheries, we just saw many women exited in terms of this particular sector. School closures also had a negative impact on the food value chain, and more particularly an example in Tanzania. One of the farmers mentioned that a lot of the children are at boarding schools, and now with the lockdown, they are part of the family food basket, and it really created strain on the purchasing of food in a very difficult times in Tanzania. So definitely impacting on household budgets both in Ghana, South Africa, and Tanzania. Next slide, please. Of course, we know that there had been an export and tourist ban, and this impacted the fish flow and supply. So the demand for fish had been sent to factories for processing. This is particularly in South Africa. It seems like those with the factory with the processing facilities could basically store the fish, but this was not necessarily meant that the fish went to the domestic market, in particular South Africa, where many people were really making the choice between either we are going to risk getting COVID or we are going to go hungry, and that's the desperation. Well, many of the factories just stored the fish. Good quality fish was stored in until export could happen again, or prices could increase in prices. So because of the hard lockdown in South Africa, this particular impacted small-scale fisheries and led to a lot of criticism in terms of how the plans around small-scale fisheries. Incomes were foul, and basically the market already dominated by industrial fisheries was supported via COVID restrictions. There was an oversupply of low cost fish, snook in South Africa, and because of the provincial borders closing, and there was an oversupply of fish on the one side, instead of moving the fish to areas where people could purchase and form part of the feeding scheme, it was sold to industrial fishing companies. And this is what some of the kind of initiatives that the government made. So you have a large supply of in terms of extensive cold storage capacity at the expense of small scale fisheries. So large firms buying up this at low prices, and this was particularly a problem in South Africa. In Tanzania, with the fact that because there were closures, there were actually more supply of fish in domestic fish supply for locals and more talk around localization of the market is what and the promotion of healthy eating was in Tanzania, but this was also picked up in Mozambique and Madagascar of the surplus of fish and more fish availability to the poor. Some of the findings in Ghana indicated, and I know they are much more deeper and extensive findings of some of the presentations in Ghana, was that canned mackerel and small pelagic fish, there was a shortage in WA. So the same in terms of Nigeria, in terms of the fish traded excluded from markets, stalls, and in terms of metropolitan areas. I think that was said already. Can we get to the next slide, please? There's no doubt about it that the burden of the reproductive work for women increased under the pandemic, and this was particularly prevalent in Ghana. And we also saw in South Africa the double burden of women with extra responsibilities. The engagement in the pre and post harvest was curtailed by market and supplementary goods that they can't produce, so kind of cut in livelihoods. Although there were a COVID grant made available for small farmers, there was no such grant made available for fishers. There was definitely some form of emergency grant for unemployed of 350 per month, which divide by 15, and you see what that gets you, and that's for a month, failed to kind of meet the food security needs. We see people stretching the food and eating less protein and filling in more staples eaten during this particular time. In Tanzania, the crisis also led to a disruption in the local short supply chain with women and in terms of key players. So a lot of the women results in Tanzania come from Mwanza. Particular impacts on the fish business and their dependence. And women also faced harm as a result of the pandemic. For example, women work in seafood processing facilities and physical distancing not possible in terms of in local shops. So this whole issue of exposure and need for food is also picked up in Tanzania. Same story in Nigeria in terms of how women and vendors and the incomes were affected during COVID. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide, and I think that there's so many much more kind of findings that I could add to it, but basically I think that the COVID pandemic definitely produced economic, social, and political challenges, which increased the vulnerability of those limited access to and insecure tenure in terms of natural resources. And it definitely exacerbates the inequalities, places an extra burden on women's responsibility during this time. So many poor people, including small-scale fisheries, were faced with this kind of choice, hunger, or the virus. Constantly, we were told so often that this is what is happening, and a lot of critics question what is the wisdom of a hard lockdown that maybe works well in the developed world, but not in a world where social relief is very limited, and you see the harsh realities of the pandemic in terms of the food system. I think it is very important in the project what I try to do as a co-PI, my colleague Ruth Hall, and also Joeri Scholtens of University of Ghana. We are 3 PIs leading this particular project. Is that what I particularly wanted to do is to place fish at the center of the food system, understand the food system that govern the fish value chain. Look at particularly at the inequalities of the food system, the gendered, poor, vulnerable, and marginalized. I think it is important that particularly what come out in Ghana, that people eat fish with tomatoes and onions. So we need to kind of see that fish, of course, for me, and I guess for most of us on this panel and audience, is that fish is the star of the plate, and I think it is the most. It's an important protein source both for security and nutrition. But it is so important to see it as part of the food system. Price increases and supply basically takes it away from a local consumption. Input cost and transport cost is also that impact. So I think it is looking at the food system and looking at fish in terms of what people purchase and other foods they purchase. I think it's very important to do. I think the important also is to look at the repurposing and reimagining localization of fish supply to improve livelihood and consumption, and governments purchasing from small-scale fishers to supply schools, hospitals, and prison. And this is particularly a problem in the South African case, where it is a big industrialized fisheries country. Regulate low-cost, nutrition-rich fish for local consumption. And I think it is also important that we also need to kind of not push to formalize every part of the chain. I think that there's a big role informal food supply play to poor and vulnerable populations, and this is particularly what we could see during the lockdown. I think too, it is also important that economic activities are basically digitized, but also on an equal terms in spaces where the food system is basically on non-digital platforms. And I think it is important, even when doing that, we should also look at what are the needs and how food is supplied to poor people. Next slide. Finally, I just want to thank Martin, Kiepi, and Derek for the invitation. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you again for another interesting presentation. So we'll go now to our final presentation by Joeri Scholtens, and then we'll hopefully have about 15 minutes or so after that for question. So Joeri, you're on.
Yes, good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Thank you, Holly. Thanks also for the organizers for the opportunity to speak here today. What I would like to do in the next 15 minutes is to actually present to you some of the findings of a research that I've been doing over the past year with a number of the colleagues, mostly from India, on the booming fish meal sector in India, and try to understand the drivers of this sector and the consequences of this fish meal sector for domestic food and nutrition security.
Oh, okay.
Next slide, please. Sorry. Yeah, so this Fish for Food project, of which this research was also part, it will basically aim to understand how fish contributes to the food and nutrition security of low-income households in India. And we also started to ask slightly more political economy kind of based questions of what actually are the trends in the macro trends in fish utilization in India, and what are the implications of these larger trends of fish utilization for low-income households' ability to actually maintain access to affordable and quality fish. So the question here is not so much who has access to sea and who controls access to sea, but who controls the fish, access to fish on land, and who controls these value chains. And our fish meal interest in this study was actually triggered by one of our PhD students doing observations in 2017 and 18 in Cuddalore, and observing very systematically that about a third of all the landings in this small town in Southeast India were actually being bought by fish meal agents, to the frustration of local female traders. And since this seemed to be such a prominent issue here and also elsewhere, we wanted to look into this in more detail. Next slide, please. I thought to start a bit with a global context here, and just a bit of a global, the global figures on the fish meal and fish oil production. It depends a bit whose data you take, but I've combined a few data sources here, and we could say that out of the approximately 84 million ton marine landings, these are data for 2018, about 18 million tons have been used to produce fish meal and fish oil. And about 70% of all the fish meal and fish oil produced is subsequently used as an ingredient for aqua feeds, so for aquaculture. And the interesting thing here is that this has been largely decreasing. The amount of fish meal produced globally has been decreasing significantly since the 90s. But in recent years, also again, depending on what data source you exactly take, there seems to be an increase again in the amount of fish meal produced globally. And basically there's a few contradictory trends at play here. At the one hand, we see that the aqua feeds or the aquaculture the company's sector is quite proud that it is moving away more and more from fish meal towards alternative ingredients. There's a lot of innovation there. It's also increasingly using processed waste from fish processing to make fish meal. At the same time, next slide, please. At the same time, the global demand for fish meal is and the global production of fat aquaculture is increasing so fast that it's basically outpacing the other two developments that I've just been mentioning. And what we see here, especially, we basically see here the amount of fish meal used by different species globally, and the most important species of the consuming fish meal here are marine shrimp at the bottom and salmon on the left. So these are the two very high value carnivore species that actually are doing the biggest appeal on fish meal production globally. Next slide, please. So this brings us to, next please. This brings us to India. To understand the boom in the fish meal sector, we first have to understand the demand of that boom. So here, this is a graph of the trend of shrimp production in India, mostly in Andhra Pradesh and East Coast, but also elsewhere. There's an incredible increase of white leg shrimp culture over the past 10 years, from almost nothing in 2010 to over 600,000 tons in 2017, and it's still growing. And all these Vivekanandan white leg shrimp is for it's for export. Virtually all of it is being exported, and these shrimp, to grow this shrimp, it requires a lot of feeds, and for these feeds we require a considerable amount of fish meal. Next slide, please. What we've been doing with a number of the colleagues, we've been basically trying to follow the fish throughout the fish meal chain from the harbor, both in the east and west coast, especially in Mangalore, towards the fish meal factories, towards the aqua feed factories, towards the shrimp farms, and towards the export. And eventually you see the shrimp packaged for a Dutch supermarket in the right bottom corner. Next slide, please. Before we move on with quantifying the amount of fish meal that we've seen in India, I think it's important to make a clear distinction here between two different fish meal chains. One is a more traditional chain. That's this kind of labor-intensive sun drying of fish that is unsuitable for human consumption, which is largely destined for poultry feed and fertilizer. This is quite visible in any in most fish landing sites throughout India. But then there is a separate fish meal chain, what I would call the industrial chain, that is really the large scale reduction of fresh fish to fish meal in an industrial way, mostly for export and for shrimp feed. And it's the second part, the second chain that remainder of this presentation is going to be about. Next slide, please. So here we see a picture of a fish meal factory in Mangalore. Next, please. And what we wanted to do, at least, is to understand the quantity of fish meal being produced in India. And what we found is we've been comparing all different sources that are saying anything about fish meal production in India, and these sources are really all over the place. There seems to be no consistent data on the amount of fish in India that is utilized for fish meal production. So next slide, please. So what we decided is to try and develop our own methodology to assess the quantity. That is basically, we have been adopting a backward calculation method, knowing the fact that almost all the fish meal produced in India is either going for export or for shrimp feeds. Very tiny amounts are going for other aqua feeds as well. And because we do know the feed conversion ratio of a shrimp culture, we also do know the amount of fish meal that is included in shrimp feeds. That is to 22% approximately. And we also know the ratio between raw fish and fish meal. We know that for every a kilogram of fish meal, we need about 4 to 5 kilogram of fish. And if you use this data, and if you also to include the import and export data of fish meal and feeds, you can actually calculate how much fish meal is being produced in India. And to our surprise and well, perhaps shock, we found that 1.2 million tons of marine fish, that is about a third of the official total landings, are being used for fish meal production in 2018. Next, please. Next, please. Yeah, thank you. So then this results in this graphic that is actually showing a trend here. A trend of fish utilization in India. So the total amount, they refer to the total marine landings in India according to the CMFRI. And then in blue at the bottom, we see the amount of fish landings that are actually exported, that are going for direct exports. Then in green and brownish, we see all the fish that is either going for surimi, for fish meal, or for shrimp. So the green area is representing the amount of fish that is used for shrimp, for fish meal production, and subsequently for shrimp exports. And the black area is what remains for domestic consumption. So we see a very concerning trend here that has not been quite obvious to us before we were putting this data together. Next slide, please. Next, please. Thank you. So there are a couple of impacts here on food security, both direct and indirect. First of all, I think this what's going on here is basically the transformation of cheap and nutritious fish into a high-end export commodity. So it essentially reallocates nutrients from poor to rich consumers, or from food insecure to food secure consumers. Secondly, what we found was that local fish traders are in a way displaced on land, and they find it extremely hard to compete with fishmeal agents, even though they're often able to pay higher prices. And that's basically due to the economy of scale, how these harbors work. And these fishmeal agents, they make agreements with ring seniors and trawlers. They make advance contracts for a full year. And the fishmeal agents, they can basically buy up any fish that is being landed in bulk. And this small-scale traders have much more difficulty to deal with those economies of scale, even though they're able to pay higher prices, because the price for sardine on the local market is of course much higher than the price for sardine offered by a fishmeal factory. There's also anecdotal evidence of price increases of small pelagic far beyond inflation rates in India, which may or may not have to do also with this trend. Next slide, please. There's also various consequences at sea. I see I have 2 minutes left. It leads to a form of biomass fishing. This has nothing to do with bycatch anymore. This is actually target catch. This is entire harbors and fleets are basically deliberately operating to catch fish for fishmeal factories. Very flexible in terms of shifting from one species to another. And small-scale fishers are also losing out here and they're being displaced because they're also not able to kind of join and supply this bulk. Next sector, please. Next slide, please. What is driving this is, of course, first and foremost, a massive export industry. Well, it's about the value of shrimp export is about $5 billion per year, and these surpluses allow for continuous expansion. There's also considerable reliance on subsidies. India is providing about $170 million per year on subsidies, mostly diesel and kerosene subsidies. That is also making fish meal artificially cheap. There's also anecdotal evidence that the fish meal sector is enjoying some form of political protection. Well, I think is also important here, and we should not underestimate the power of narratives. The aquaculture sector, the agricultural, also the international organizations representing marine ingredients, they have this powerful set of narratives why turning waste into high value export products, The idea of most of the fish utilized with fish meal is inedible anyway, so this is a great way to add value. It's even called a circular economy of reusing waste in a productive way. Also, the issue of certification has also been used to legitimize this kind of industry. And next slide, please. And I think that is quite problematic here. We see a few fact sheets by the IFO, the International Marine Ingredients Organization. You know, the idea that aquaculture is aquaculture products, they fish the way nature intended. Marine ingredients are feeding the world. Marine ingredients have a multiplier effect, and these narratives are quite true and fact-based if you select the facts rightly. So, but I think it's really important also for academics to open up these narratives and see under which context they may be more or less true. Next slide, please. I think it's important here. Well, there are so many calls in India, at least, but also in Mauritania and elsewhere, to call for curbing of this growth of the fish meal industry. The question is really how, and I think one of the more important things here is that we have to, also policymakers need to become much more explicit that shrimp culture expansion is not possible without considering the marine consequences. Every expansion of a shrimp industry has an implication on marine fisheries as well, as long as fish meal has a certain amount of as long as aqua feeds have a certain amount of fish meal ingredients. And whether it's about curbing the shrimp sector, or whether it's about curbing the fish meal production, or whether it's about curbing the supply, so that's about fish food management, I think that's up for debate, because these are really three kind of sectors that are completely interdependent and intertwined. And perhaps it's not just about generating more expertise. It may also require a certain amount of politicization and attention in media and public debate to confront this idea of expansion of shrimp culture is feeding the world. Next final slide. I think well, what we've seen in this expansion of the sector is, I think, a remarkable transformation of fish utilization in Indian fisheries, driven by the dependency of shrimp culture on marine fisheries. Fish meal demand has become a significant driver of a destructive fishery and undermines the availability and accessibility of fish for Indian consumers. And I think there's a lot of international attention for the positive trends, like investment in alternative ingredients and a growing share of fish processing waste in fish meal. But I think this easily overlooks the elephant in the room, the simple fact that fish meal and fish oil production is increasing in places like India, in Mauritania, in Peru recently as well, with serious food security and trade-offs and food equity implications. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Joeri. I'm going to ask our 5 speakers to all turn on their video. We have about 14 or 15 minutes for questions, and we can stop the screen sharing. Yeah, great, thank you. So there are lots of wonderful questions in the Q&A box as well as comments, so I would invite all of the panelists to read through those. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all of them. But I want to start with a general question and invite our 5 speakers, whoever wants to comment on it. So this question comes from Robert Arthur, and the question is, informal arrangements have been identified as important to enable access by poor consumers. Are there examples of how these informal arrangements can be supported or even restored in the face of increased commercialization of small fish and the food systems to which they contribute? So one of you would like to take that question. Vivek or Sharon?
I'll jump in. I don't know, but it's something I've got my eye out for. There's definitely things that make it a little bit more difficult. So for example, from the data that I've collected so far, which is of course for a limited area within a very big country, so there's a lot of diversity. When the pandemic hit, the government responded pretty quickly with actual direct food aid. But as I mentioned, so this included eggs, and they did bring in some of the mobile traders to help do the delivery. It was not clear that they got paid for that in any form other than in kind. So one of my informants said they did that. They didn't get any money, but they did get some eggs from it, which I assume was the intended way that happened, not that some eggs just sort of disappeared off the top. But there's that food aid, again, while it was very important for the consumers and local food security, then with people having such depressed purchasing power, they took advantage, or they bought even less from their mobile traders. And of course that then made things more difficult. So I guess that's an example of something that sort of has the opposite effect, which doesn't quite answer your question, but that's a little bit from Indonesia.
Vivek or Anderson, do you have any ideas about informal arrangements and how they can be supported or restored? No?
Can I try?
Absolutely, yes, please jump in.
I've done a study in 2013 to kind of look at, the informal value chain, and there was a big kind of focus on that. We need to formalize the value chain, and if we formalize the value chain, we're going to get better prices for fishers. And what indirectly happened was that, of course, fishers got better prices, but in the end, fish that normally went to communities via the informal trade was now formalized, got better prices, but no fish went back to the community. So I think that for me, I think it is often that we have to kind of really think of what we mean by supporting. Do we mean that we want to formalize? I think there's also different, and specifically in terms of some of the Ghana inputs in terms of informal markets. Many people in the informal sector really feel that is formal for them. What do we understand? We had big debates as to what do we mean by formalizing? Do we mean by commercializing fully? Some want to go there, some don't want to go. So I think it is quite tricky. But also what we saw during the lockdown is that hard lockdown, cutting the informal sector, and also allowing people to go out and do work on a daily, informal work on a daily basis, impacted their food security dramatically. So I would say that I think for starters, we need to keep it informal. And also I think it is a debate in terms of the levels of informality where many people in that group think that it's already formal according to their point of view or standards. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah, go ahead, Vivek, sorry.
I want to add something briefly. In the case of Ghana, some of these informal arrangements are working perfectly well. If we take the case of, for example, the arrangements between fish mothers who are traders who finance the fishing operations of fishermen, it is something that is working quite well, even though there is unequal power between these two parties, where because the fish mothers provide resources to the fishermen, they are able to collectively influence the price that fishers sell the fish to them. So you can, if you want to formalize these and bring in, let's say, formal institutions to provide credit for to support fishermen. The fishermen will tell you that getting access to credit from these formal institutions also come at a higher cost to them, beside the collateral issues that they introduce. So these informal activities, arrangements are working quite well. And so we may have to maintain it or maintain the status quo. Thank you.
Thank you. Vivek, did you want to add a comment as well?
Yeah. See, basically, at least in the Indian context, when we are talking about mechanisms for the poor to access low-cost fish, small fish, the existing chain, especially the small vendor chain, is already the best mechanism. It doesn't necessarily exclusively cater to the poor. Depends on where localities, which customer base. So there, it's not that it's entirely a dedicated chain for the poor. But having said that, it by its very nature, it is more accessible to the poor. So maintaining that chain, keeping it competitive, creating a level playing ground for these small operators to function would be the best mechanism, or that is the way to strengthen that mechanism for the poor. And there are many ideas on that. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I think that you all make a very important point that we often refer to these traditional market systems as the informal economy, when in fact, it is actually the formal system for getting food, distributing food from producer to consumer. And so we need to kind of rethink how we understand those systems. Related to that question is a question for Moenieba from Martin, in which he asks, COVID-19 actually seems to have improved food security for poor consumers in Tanzania and Madagascar. Why did it not do the same in other countries studied? Or framed differently, is it always true that there are winners and losers in fish chains? If low-income consumers win, female fish vendors lose, and vice versa? Are win-wins possible?
Very good question, Martin. I really thought about your question on, when you kind of look at as win-win possible. I think that, in the South African case with the highly commercialized industrial fisheries, small-scale fisheries often seen as a form of competition, and because of the fact that there's a lot of space for cold storage, there's often seen as an opportunity for profit in context of huge inequality, food insecurity. So I think for that reason, we took the approach in this particular project to look at the political economy approach more from understanding the whole food system. And it is about looking at who actually benefits. And you're right, if the one benefit and then it just follows either a woman or the one that are on the receiving end, and particularly during the COVID, I think that women were basically more hard hit, because after particular from the South African perspective, after a couple of weeks, fishermen were allowed to go out and fish, but women were not allowed to continue with their practices. So I think that I thought for a while that at least in the South African case, that we could start speaking about more, instead of waiting for the market to open for export and depend on the export market and prices, why not rethink and reimagine it to kind of think of more localization of market, think about the food security and the nutrition and the importance of that. I think the government is not even touching on that. And most of the packaged food relief, it's mainly based on the protein of fish is not necessarily always considered, but it's all staples and tin food, and not necessarily providing a good capturing of a lot of the kind of informal small scale producers as forming part of that relief. It is even the companies have made more money during the lockdown than small scale fishers or small scale producers on that matter. So yeah, hope I answer your question.
Okay. Thank you. We only have about a minute or two left, so I'd like to turn to a question that was posed to Joeri. The question is, there are a lot of movements concerning fish meal and fish oil in the literature. It is now possible to find greener substitutes such as plant meals and plant oils or insects. Is this being discussed in India? And if not, could it be introduced? It might be more expensive in the short term, but cheaper than fish meal in the long run.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I'm not an expert in the composition of aquafeeds, and I'm sure people in the audience actually know much more about this. But what I understand from the feed sector, from the aquafeed sector in India, is that there are all these innovations going on. There's a lot of developments in developing alternative ingredients. It's really the billion-dollar question of replacing fish meal with other ingredients. The thing is, even though those developments are following, those innovations are following up each other quite rapidly, the scalability has been quite problematic so far. And one of the reasons, or yeah, not the only reason, but one of the reasons is the fact that fish meal, the way it is being currently produced in India, is simply extremely cheap. You know, it relies on, it benefits from cheap labor, on subsidies, on cheap labor, on a hardly regulated fishery. So I think as long as the fish meal is being produced the way it currently is, it will be even more difficult to make those alternatives scalable. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Unfortunately, our time is up, and so we won't be able to get to a lot of the questions that were posed, and so I would invite those of you who have questions to contact the speakers directly, and I'm sure they'll be happy to engage with you. And just let me thank all of our speakers and give a virtual round of applause. And I think next we have a short break, if that's correct, Martin.
So thank you very much, Holly, for moderating this very interesting session. We are having a short break up to 4:15, so 15 minutes to get a cup of tea, go to the restroom, whatever. So 15 minutes.